Guys, 11 shopping days until Christmas, plenty of time. I'm Charlie Sykes. Sunday Insight starts right now. Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. In the week that was, the president addresses the nation about gun control and terror, but announces no new strategy. UWM's men's basketball team beats the UW Badgers for the first time in 23 years. A wild shootout shuts down I-43 for hours, but this is still a safe city, right, Mayor Barrett? The Packers are back on top the NFC North, and the world braces for a new Star Wars movie. But we start with Donald Trump.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on.
Reaction came fast from Democrats and from his fellow Republicans, including Speaker Paul Ryan.
This is not conservatism. What was proposed yesterday is not what this party stands for. And more importantly, it's not what this country stands for.
But the proposed ban worked for Trump on one obvious level. If he wanted to suck up all the media attention last week, he succeeded. But at what cost? Joining me on our panel this morning, the Milwaukee Community Journal's Michael Holt, former State Representative Michelle Litchens, defense attorney Dan Adams, and media trackers Brian Sikma. Brian, obviously Donald Trump knows how to get attention. Your reaction to his proposal?
Well, Donald Trump was appealing to the very worst of human nature by with these comments, and they also represent an assault on religious liberty when you look at it, because if the government of the United States has the ability to tell Muslim citizens they can't re-enter this country, or they're second-class citizens, they can tell any member of any faith that. These are horrible comments, and they appeal to the worst in us, and they should be repudiated by Americans of all political stripes.
But he's obviously feeding into legitimate anxiety about Islamic terrorism and the questions that we have seen about the vetting process and about whether or not we know who's coming into the country. Now, he's arguing this would be a temporary halt just until we get our act together. So what's wrong with that?
Well, you have Hillary Clinton on one side of the political aisle saying that we don't have a clash of civilizations here. You have the president who's consistently refusing to acknowledge that we are at war with ISIS on a grand scale because this is a clash of civilizations. On the other hand, you have Donald Trump reacting. So you have Democrats denying what's really taking place, Donald Trump overreacting, and that's what the problem is here. People are tired of Democrats, but unfortunately there's not enough reasonable voices speaking up on this.
Okay, Michael Holt.
Yeah, it does bring out the worst in us, and it feeds off this fear, particularly in light of what happened in San Bernardino. The irony is that Jimmy Carter did something similar when he was president, but we were actually at war at the particular time.
Well, no, actually what Jimmy Carter did was to ban Iranian citizens from entering the country during the hostage crisis, which was singling out the residents of a certain country, not an entire religion, which of course, raises the question.
But the irony is that if you look up the definition, Muslim actually means a person who follows God. So, I mean, I guess that's all of us. So he's just going to stop any
All right, now this came out the day after a poll showed that he was losing his lead in Iowa to Ted Cruz. And there was a lot of cynical assumption that maybe he was doing this in order to get back up. At the end of last week, there were public opinion polls that showed that Donald Trump had not only not been hurt by this, but maybe is extending his lead. So how is this playing out right now, Michelle Litchens?
He had gained some serious ground in some states, which is very frightening. But Donald Trump is saying things that people want to hear the president say. Not necessarily that we want to ban all Muslims from coming in this country, but he is strong and he is arguing for Americans and he wants us to be safe. He's not giving us an answer. He's not saying how we're going to solve this problem. But I think a lot of people are gravitating towards him because they are so desperate for a strong leader who says, I'm going to fight for you guys.
Okay. I mean, just being the toughest guy and saying, playing to people's vices, I don't think makes you a strong leader. I think being wise and circumspect makes you a wise leader and a strong leader. I'm amazed that we are about 50 days from when voting starts in Iowa. We have him still leading most national polls, and I think the Republicans are in a tight spot because if he becomes the nominee or this thing drags on, Republicans are going to be vanquished come November.
I agree with that, and here's the problem, because I do think that there are legitimate fears, there are concerns. You know, to a certain extent, the failure of the president to reassure the American public that he was fighting it creates the opening, but then the opening should be filled by rational, intelligent, responsible, as opposed to this raw demagoguery that we're seeing here. And you know what was interesting was that some of the Trump supporters were actually saying, well, we've done this before, but in World War II, remember Franklin Delano Roosevelt interned all of the Japanese. Well, that is considered to be one of the darkest moments in American life.
And at the same time, I do think that people are going to wise up. He does not have any solutions to this problem, but he's out there. He is playing to people's fears right now, so I don't think people are going to continue to follow him, you know, when it comes to Election Day in
But you
February.
said that about 6 months ago, too.
Yeah, we have said
Every month you keep saying the same thing, and he's extended his lead. I mean, what does this say about the state of America, not just the Republican Party? You know, are people really just
and he still has major influencers, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, who are still carrying his water in many ways.
The mainstream media too, because they have not begun to hold him accountable for these statements like they would hold a Ted Cruz or any other Republican candidate accountable if they had said these things.
This is I wrote a piece last week for Right Wisconsin. This is really this is a gut check. This is a time to choose what conservatives actually stand for. You know, not only did I think he gave the president a tremendous gift. The president gave that speech on Sunday night, which was really a failure. And people were talking about the lack of new ideas. And what does Donald Trump do? You know, he changes the subject to be about himself, but also he validates so many of the left's talking points. You know, about Islamophobia, about some sort of this kind of overreach. And again, the problem is, I think, that he has shut out the more rational, intelligent voices. But I do think that he did one thing, at least early in the week, that you had people from Hillary Clinton to Dick Cheney agreeing that this was wrong. And there's something about this, and I think even Scott Walker talked about this. There's a fundamental American value that we do not discriminate against people based on their faith. We have never taken an action where we have banned an entire religion. That does cross a line, and I think it's very disturbing. I mean, it's disturbing on one level that he doesn't get that, but it is genuinely disturbing that apparently a large number of Americans also don't get that you can deal with this, but you don't deal with this by trashing, something that really does make American exceptional. What does your glass half full? What has your glass half empty this week? Let's go around the table. Michael Holt, you are first.
Well, my glass is half empty because Donald Trump, as we said, remained the front runner for the Republican presidential nomination, even after suggesting Muslims be banned from the country. My glass is half full because there was a bipartisan repudiation of Trump's idiotic and racist suggestion.
Michelle Litchens.
My glass is half full because after 5.5 years of study, the DNR will advance Waukesha's water diversion bid to the Great Lakes governors for approval. It is half empty because if just one governor says no, the whole plan is stopped.
Dan Adams.
Well, my glass is half empty because the Wisconsin Public Records Board has taken actions to limit the public's access to emails, texts, and other messages deemed transitory. This is bad news, and the legislature should correct it. My glass is half full because the attack on open government has created a motley coalition of activists on the left and the right who know that closing off the public's access to records is a dangerous policy.
Brian Sikma.
Well, my glass is half full because Wisconsin now requires food stamp recipients to participate in work programs to receive benefits. My glass is half empty because a Milwaukee area charity leader recently called the common sense provision slavery.
Well, my glass is half full because responsible, principled conservatives like Paul Ryan, Dick Cheney, and Paul Ryan and Scott Walker have denounced Donald Trump's radical proposal to ban an entire religion from entering the country. It's half empty because his appeal to our darkest impulses appears to be actually boosting him in the polls. Next on Sunday Insight, what's behind the record sales of guns in the United States? A run on guns. Could it actually turn out that President Obama is the greatest gun salesman in history? Even as the president and his fellow Democrats push stronger gun control measures, Americans are buying guns and ammunition at record levels. Gun background checks spiked after terrorist attacks in California. And so here's the trend. Before 9/11, gun sales in this country averaged between 3 and 6 million a year. That rose to around 8.5 to 9 million guns a year after the September 11th attacks. But in recent years, Americans have been buying somewhere between 17 to 20 million guns a year. And it seems that every time there's an incident, every time the president gives a speech, those numbers go up. What is happening, Michelle Litchens?
We are nervous that our government wants to take away our firearms, and with the other incident in California, people want to make sure they can protect themselves. And as Americans, we want to protect ourselves, and so we're going out there and we're buying firearms.
It is interesting. I had not realized this. After the Newtown, Connecticut massacre, which I think was one of the first, outbreaks of people saying we need to crack down on gun ownership, that was one of the biggest spikes in gun purchases that we've seen in years in this country. So what is going on?
It's simply economics, Charlie. The American people love firearms, and there are people out there that are responsible firearms owners, such as myself. And whenever you hear the president say, we may limit this, we may end this, well, then
Why
certainly
do
that's
Americans
supply.
love firearms? What do we mean love firearms?
Independent.
Because whenever you squeeze that trigger at a target, there's a sound that goes off. There's the recoil. They're great for hunting.
Okay.
But there's a lot of reasons.
Okay, so Dan Adams, in all of your East Side coffee shops, when people are sitting around going, "Oh, the guns are terrible. This is terrible. We need to have the president give another speech about guns," and millions of guns go off the shelves. Cause, effect?
I think everyone who's spoken already has got a point. I mean, there's anxiety about regulation, but there is this fetish thing about guns in this country right now.
That's not a fetish.
Maybe the wrong word.
You made
but there is a cultural attachment to having a gun, not just having a gun, right, for protection.
Okay.
Multiple guns.
Okay, guys, you're trivializing this. The reality is that I think people who've never owned a gun before look at these things and they go, look, you know what? We live in a dangerous world, and if I don't have a gun, I might not be able to defend myself and my family. And I think every time you have an incident like this, every time it becomes apparent that, you know what, there's not going to be a cop who's going to answer every one of your 911 calls immediately. I do think there's a legitimate concern, but I do think you have this perfect storm that not only are people, thinking about the need for self-defense, but then every time the politicians then, at the same moment, begin talking about the possibility that you may not be able to do it, it creates this demand. I mean, it is kind of the perfect storm.
Let's be honest about this.
I'm
a gun owner myself. I don't get that thrill. It sounds like something else. Something totally different. But what the president and I and other people of common sense are opposed to are not the handguns, not the Berettas. They're concerned about those automatic weapons that these terrorists just used that you can get in any gun store today. I was in a gun store the other day. I mean, they had these assault rifles with scopes on them, and I mean, give me a break. What do you need that for?
Okay, so
to kill a deer?
But what do you suggest? I mean, do you honestly believe there would have been a single terrorist incident in this country that would have been prevented by laws that limit the law-abiding citizens having legal access to guns?
I think you could shoot fewer people with a handgun. If there's a lot of people, than with something you spray across the room.
The firearms they were using too. Right?
Every
And they are going to
illegal in
continue to get
California.
those firearms whether they're sold legally in the stores or not, and we know this.
Well, I think part of it is, and let's go back to what's actually happening in the real world, is that Americans. I mean, it's become almost, I guess, maybe a tenet of liberal faith that guns are a bad thing and that more guns make us a more dangerous country. But the reality is that Americans apparently think the opposite. Americans believe that if they go out and they get a gun to defend their family, not because they get a thrill from it, but because they're afraid. They don't know. And I think that there is this growing lack of trust in government, growing lack of trust in this government and law enforcement to keep us safe. People do not think that makes it a more dangerous world when they go out and buy guns.
Just to add, you just went over the numbers of the gun sales, how they've been increasing, and our gun crime is down to the 1970s level. So we know more guns out there. It doesn't equal gun crime.
But nationally they do. Now, you may not want to hear it, but we'll tell you anyway, of course. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice. Michael Holt, you're first.
Well, based upon our conversation, I'm going to repeat last week's. For all of you folks who have purchased guns after San Bernardino killings, there's a greater probability that you shoot yourself than confront a terrorist. Think about that.
Michelle Litchens.
If you haven't signed up for Obamacare yet, you'd better do it fast. The fine increases by 47% to $969 if you qualify for subsidies, or $1,450 if you don't.
Dan Adams.
Hey, listen, if you live in Milwaukee County, yes, you consider running for the county board. 8 supervisors don't have opponents, including Chairman Theo Lipscomb, who represents Glendale, Brown Deer, and River Hills. No opponent equals no accountability.
Brian Sikma.
Well, Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Shirley Abrahamson used to be the Chief Justice, and she just lost that job months ago, but her official website still claims she's the top jurist. In the words of a famous song, my unsolicited advice to Abrahamson is, let it go.
So is Dan Adams running for county board? Last week, the UW Board of Regents reaffirmed its support for free speech and open debate, saying exploration and deliberation and debate may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. Well, my advice is for Marquette University. Pay attention. Follow their lead and drop your attempts to fire Professor John McAdams for writing a blog post you didn't like. Next on Sunday Insight, the state's largest juvenile prison in trouble with the law. Well, this is getting ugly. A sweeping investigation at the state's largest juvenile prison is looking at allegations of sexual assault, physical child abuse, the intimidation of victims and witnesses, and a possible cover-up. The probe focuses on Lincoln Hill School for Boys in Irma, which is about 30 miles north of Wausau. And last week, 2 officials responsible for the school were removed from their jobs, but there are questions about what the state's Secretary of Corrections, Ed Wall, knew about the allegations. So let's talk about this. How big a deal is this? How far is this going to go?
Well, from what the reports, and it's still a John Doe, so officially it's secrecy.
Yeah.
We don't know a whole lot about what's going on. The allegations that have been floated in these reports sound pretty heinous.
Yeah.
I mean, these kids are incorrigible. They've had tough lives.
Yeah.
There's a reason they're in Lincoln Hills, but they deserve our protection.
Yeah.
I'm kind of fearful of what comes out of this.
Yeah, I mean, it does certainly sound, at least from these initial reports, as if you had a culture that allowed this to take place, and then supervisors that looked the other way. Michael Holt?
Yeah, and it sounds like a bad movie, really.
Yeah.
We needed one of the inmates, I guess you call them, to escape and go to the Journal-Sentinel and big expose, etc. But I mean, if half of this stuff is true, I think we need a total investigation of the entire prison system.
Well, we'll see. So does Ed Wall get away with his job? Does he keep his job?
We're going to find out, right, from this investigation if he's at fault for covering this up or not. I do think it is a challenge to be a guard for a juvenile place like this because those kids know how to push.
Yeah.
They know how to push as far as they can until the guards have to react.
Charlie, what I found disturbing about all this was AFSCME, the union that represents these guards, the moment these allegations came out, they jumped to the defense of the employees and basically made it sound like it was the inmates that were the problem here. Look, anytime you're in a Department of Corrections situation, it's the people who run that facility that are responsible for what happens in that facility. And so it's despicable of the union to use this for political purposes.
And I think that this poses a real problem on several different levels. It's not just that you have perhaps some very bad actors, some bad management, but if in fact there was an attempt to cover this up and conceal this, as we know, the cover-up is sometimes worse than the crime, and the crimes seem pretty bad if in fact this is true, and these are just the initial reports. What is it you don't get this week? Let's go on the table. Michael Holt, you're first.
What I don't get is why nobody seems to be concerned about the Supreme Court's hearings on affirmative action, which, incidentally, was started by a Republican, Richard Nixon.
I'm concerned. Michelle Litchens.
Charlie, I don't get why Michael Vick is now the chosen advocate to lobby against animal cruelty. He may have changed his ways, but lobbying?
Dan Adams.
I don't get why Milwaukee Alderman Tony Zielinski publicly brags that he has plans to improve MPS graduation and test scores, but when asked for those plans, they don't exist. Education policy is complex, Alderman. Maybe you ought to study up.
Brian Sigma.
What I don't get is why Lawrence University in Appleton is inviting a radical social activist to speak at a January event when that activist once served as a straw gun purchaser for weapons used in a crime. Doesn't the left care about gun violence?
Yeah, maybe. Well, what I don't get, he's insulted Hispanics, women, the disabled, prisoners of war, African Americans. He throws schoolyard insults at his opponents. He brags, bullies, blusters, and proposes abandoning some of our most fundamental values. But Donald Trump still leads in the polls, so no, I really don't get that. Next on Sunday Inside, our panel picks the winners and losers of the week, but first, here's your morning news update. It's time for our panel to pick the winners and losers of the week. Michael Holt, you're first.
Well, my loser, Democratic presidential candidate and frontrunner Hillary Clinton, whose support of Mayor Rahm Emanuel has angered black leaders from coast to coast. My winner, Bernie Sanders, who received a major, or maybe minor, depending on how you look at it, endorsement from the Family Unity Party, or PAC, or whatever it is.
Michelle Hitchens.
My winner is Speaker Paul Ryan. In a short time as Speaker, Ryan has completely turned around that office by building consensus, taking important votes, and proactively reaching out to the public to defend Republican ideals. My loser is the New York Times, who for the first time in 95 years published an op-ed on their front page above the fold titled "End the Gun Epidemic in America." They must not read their own news because gun violence has been declining for the past few years, but as obvious gun haters, the Times couldn't help themselves.
Dan Adams.
Well, my winner is Milwaukee City Attorney Grant Langley. Earlier this year, several notable candidates were mentioned as his potential opponents, but all have passed on the race, and Langley looks to be unopposed in April's election. My losers, sadly, are Wisconsin's 40,000 Teamsters Union retirees who are facing big cuts to their pensions. The cuts are due to big drops in current membership, and their pension fund just can't cover its promises. This stinks.
Brian Sickman.
Well, my loser is Minnesota Governor Mark Dayton, a Democrat who thinks it may be time to remove 6 paintings from the state capitol because they depict Minnesota soldiers during the Civil War. Dayton believes the paintings are controversial. Since when did fighting to eliminate slavery become controversial? My winner is Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska, who made a profound video condemning radical Islamic terrorism while summoning the best in the American ideal and explaining that as an open society, we embrace religious liberty.
You're right about that. My loser this week is President Barack Obama, who tried to reassure the nation about his approach to terrorism and failed miserably when people realized that he had no new ideas. My winner of the week is President Barack Obama. Thanks to Donald Trump, the national debate quickly shifted to Trump's outrageous proposal and away from President Obama's failure. Quite a gift to the president. Thanks for joining us, and join me for my radio show Monday morning on News Radio 620 WTMJ from 8:30 until noon. Have a great week.